So I have been with Threadbare Consulting for about a year and a half now. Just get to help coffee business owners all over the planet improve their operations and help people start their own coffee shops. That's kind of within the niche of what I do at Threadbare. It's mostly like helping people start and then scale up to a couple. And then Michael usually will help people with larger multi-unit options. So that's sort of what I've been doing.
Wow. Very cool. Very cool. I have, so in terms of how the rest of this goes, so for those folks that come to you in consulting, do they typically have a barista background, or they're, what is that mix of like, hey, I want to create this community space versus I love coffee? How do you see that, and what do you advise?
Yeah. So generally speaking, most of the people who come to me are folks who are at a different career stage in their life, that largely just because they're the ones who have money to help pay for somebody to like help them get past what they don't know faster. And so a lot of times for the folks who have been baristas, the amount of expendable income that's available for learning new things is just not as strong. And so they're sort of like in the school of hard knocks territory. And I really try to help people in that situation as much as humanly possible.
Mm-hmm.
And I tend to go probably more at bat for that than it would be wise economically for me, but it's just such an important part of my journey that I have to do that. I have to give people some help and insight, and we really try to make it like affordable and approachable for people. But I do always recommend that people work in a coffee shop first as a barista, because it is the best education that you can get, and it's the only one that you actually get paid to get. Most other educations you have to pay. Some knucklehead who was a barista and then started his own company for a while and really likes to taste coffee and put it into a spreadsheet to tell you how to do things. It's like you have to pay someone else to do that, or you can go work for someone. There's an opportunity cost there, especially for folks at a higher wage level in their career. So it's always a recommendation that I have. If you don't, there are some extra hurdles you have to overcome, which is totally doable. In fact, one of my favorite other coffee companies in the Seattle area is Five Stones, and Jake, he did not work in coffee before he started, and he did a really good job of just getting a lot of stuff right, despite having never done it. So it's totally possible, but I always recommend it because you learn a ton. You learn all the systems. And honestly, one of the biggest things, if anybody's listening to this who's thinking about starting a coffee shop but hasn't yet, the single biggest two issues that kill coffee shops are a horrible lease that is just, there's not enough business to justify that lease level. Even if it's a good deal in terms of the real estate market in a cost per square footage, it may not be an effective place for you to put a coffee shop. And then secondly, people build coffee shops wrong, and it hamstrings their operation long term because everything is set up super inefficiently. And so they can never bring their labor percentages down to the levels that they need to make it work properly. Coffee is a business of volume, and you just have to move volume to really make it work. And so if you get it structurally wrong in either of those two ways, it's really difficult to climb out of. It's not impossible, but it's difficult.
What's the biggest mistake you see folks make on workflow that hamstring them?
Oftentimes the grinders get put on the wrong side. Everything sort of like bottlenecks into one specific area, or movement is really disconnected and there's lots of paths that cross. Every time paths cross, you lose efficiency because people are running into each other and all sorts of things. So one of the most helpful things, if you're not sure if you maybe did something wrong, or if you could, one way you can find out how to improve your space planning is to do what's called a spaghetti map. It's basically where you take a floor plan and you get colored pencils, and every person gets a different colored pencil who's on your staff, and then you just trace out with the colored pencils where they move throughout their shift. And you can see sort of like the hot spots that develop.
Wow.
And so if you have one person who's at one station and they consistently have a hot spot that they're going to, condensing those spaces and moving them closer together and rearranging things can actually be a really powerful way of just sort of like figuring out how to optimize your space planning. So spaghetti maps are really great.
This reminds me of the conversation we were having the other day of our experience as baristas, and introducing, when you have the like made to order food options, and if those workflows aren't dialed in, how much, especially when you're like slow part of the day and you got one barista, and we were do paninis, and it was like you'd be making coffee and you had to walk over, halfway across the store to go be working on a panini press, and you're sweating as a barista, watching that line stack up. You all did a really great flow at Narrative. How did you think about that with the made to order?
Yeah, so that was a little bit more of a retrofit, but it uses the same principles, like don't cross
Yeah.
paths, try to keep things as close as possible, use as much cubic footage as you possibly can to your advantage. People only think of square footage. Cubic footage matters far more, like using your wall space well and getting everything structured in the right way. That all makes a really huge difference. Another little pro tip for people is if you want to know how inefficient your space is, if you use any sort of a step counter, you can work a role in your space and then track how many steps you do throughout a given day of busyness, and then just build up a few like runs of how many steps you do normally. So maybe you do 11,000 steps, and then you can make some changes and then see if that reduces your step count. That's another really helpful way to figure out, like, did I actually improve my efficiency or not? Because usually you did if you're not moving around as much.
Brilliant.
As you're talking about the keys to success being really copies of volume business, one thing I run into with a lot of coffee shop owners is, we don't want to become a Starbucks where it's just pushing out coffee. We want to be able to connect with customers. How did you take those principles that can kind of be counterintuitive, but ensure you're getting the volume and moving things out efficiently while giving your baristas the opportunity to connect with your customers and create that loyalty?
Yeah, so one of the things that I push back on people somewhat, and I hope that I've communicated how deeply hospitality matters to me by this point. But one of the things I push back on people on sometimes is that they forget that not everybody needs the same things in the same moment. Like sometimes hospitality is spending time with someone, and sometimes hospitality is just making that drink and letting them get on with their day because they have a busy schedule. And so, like, it is a real balancing act in terms of meeting the customer or the guest with the service that they want and need in a given moment. And so having the ability to do both really matters. It is not hospitable to spend 18 minutes with one person and then letting a whole line of people go without being served. That is not hospitable. I don't think there has to be an animosity between quality and speed either, especially with the technology that we have these days. You can be fast and good, And so those are all things that like really, they matter to me, and I think you can do them well. The other thing that I would encourage folks to do is if you really want to create an environment that is slower paced, you have to charge more for it. You have to build higher margin for that, or you're not going to be successful. The reason that Rolex can have a showroom that is the crazy level that it is because their price per unit is substantial. If they were selling $10 G-Shocks, they would go out of business immediately. They could not make their rent, right? So if you want a slower pace and a more luxurious thing, you have to charge more for it. There's not a way around it, and people want the slowness and they want the comfy and the cozy, but they don't want to charge what they need to charge to make that economically work out. I see it kill business owners constantly. And so like you have to pick the values that matter to you and then adjust your business to make that make sense. You have to sometimes be a little bit brave and make a hard decision that says like, we wanted this experience and this is something that's worth costing me for. So I will charge what I have to make this happen. And if it's not successful, then people just didn't want this experience. Then you can always regroup and reevaluate and those sorts of things. But yeah, those are a few thoughts.
That's great.
We kind of talk about that a bit. Convenience is customer service, and finding ways to make it as convenient as possible is a form of customer service that you can offer your customers.
Just pricing a menu in general is one where we've seen a lot where owners typically hurt themselves coming out of the gate, where they're not thinking about what are the benchmarks we need to have for margin on my drinks, on my food. And then when prices go up, like they have been in this environment, I know that sense of responsibility to the community will make owners really reluctant to decrease prices. So is there any benchmarks or things like that you could share to owners that will help them have a healthier business?
Yeah. So one of the things that I really try to remind business owners of is that for 9 out of 10 of them, the reason that they own a business is because they tend to be very frugal, very penny pinching, and they tend to be very value oriented. And they're not an average customer. They're not the average person. There are things that we call emotional price anchors. And this is a thing that you notice anytime you talk to an old person and they're like, oh, I used to get a pack of gum for, 1 penny. And so what happens is the older you get, the further back in history your emotional price anchor is. It's the same thing with music, right? Like there's a sort of a point where, generally speaking, the average person sort of locks into a moment when they're a teenager. Usually that's sort of like when their consciousness of pricing in general becomes a reality, and then they anchor down to that as sort of like their expectation of reality. And one of the things I say constantly is that unmet expectation is the source of all conflict. And so managing expectations is super important for reducing conflict. And so when people have these conflicting moments about their pricing or those sorts of things, and they aren't thinking about the fact that they have an emotional price anchor somewhere in the past that's like, especially now, is like forever ago in terms of inflation, right? And so dollar for dollar, it's just not the same thing. And so people just often don't even think about those things, and it increases the emotional intensity and weight of having to raise prices. And the risk is so high for almost every business owner that if they get it wrong, it will put them in the grave financially. And so it is a huge ask the first time you do it as a business owner. And so if you've never done it, please know that the very first time is the hardest. It feels the most scary when you've never done it before. And then after you've gotten it under your belt, you realize that it's a normal course of business, that everybody does it. Like, I'll never forget the time when someone was like, your eggs, like you're charging this much for eggs? And they're like, Denny's doesn't charge me that much. And so I went and looked up the price of what Denny's charged for an additional egg on something, and it was more than we paid for our like high quality brown eggs, because that person had an emotional price anchor somewhere in the past that was not real and didn't reflect reality. And so you have to constantly do the work to reset your emotional price anchor as a business owner, or it will harm you long term. So I developed a system for that around like our costing and price sheet. Every quarter, we would go through and reevaluate our prices, make sure that our margins were good. If they weren't, then we would work to bring our pricing down, like through negotiations with folks or finding a new vendor or something. But just staying on top of that is such an important thing. And what I will say is we ran into the same things. And generally speaking, there is a lot of price elasticity there, because what people don't realize is the value that coffee brings for someone's daily life. It's still within that affordable luxury territory, and it's still within striking distance of every other sort of entry level product. Like the demand goes down when supply increases, and price tends to bring things down, but only if there's an alternative. If there's no other alternative and it's filling a genuine need, then prices will still go up. And we all know this because we've all experienced the housing market being what it is. And when it's a genuine need, and in our case, coffee's not a genuine need. It's not. But for a lot of people, it's the small comfort that they get, and it's still worth spending this microscopically small percentage of their annual income to have this small benefit every day. Like, it's still a great move for most people. And so we get so nervous around it, and I understand. I've been there. It's scary and terrifying. And they are talking more about price sensitivity now than I've seen them talk about for a long time. So that's also a real thing. But you have to do what you got to do to stay in business, and you're only going to subsidize it for people. Like, that's what I always try to remind people is when you artificially deflate the price of something, you encourage them to make the decision that's more economically harmful, and you're the one bearing the brunt of that. A sort of ridiculous example that I use to help illustrate it is if you offered me cauliflower for $3 or ribeye for $3, I'm taking the ribeye every second of the day. But if you offered me cauliflower for $3 and ribeye for $16, I might pick the cauliflower. And because you didn't artificially subsidize that price for me, you put the impetus on me to make the decision that was right for me financially. Mm-hmm. You still get data. You still get like decision on like, oh, more people are buying cauliflower all of a sudden. Okay, let's go ahead and make more cauliflower dishes then. You still have a tool in your belt as a business owner to manage those things. Nobody cares about the negative impact to you. They only care about the negative impact to them. Or it's not that they don't care. They just don't think about it, right? It's just not conscious of like, hey, who could possibly be hurting for me in the supply chain? They just assume, oh, everyone's taken care of. Cool, I'll buy this.
I love that. The person that mentioned the price of eggs, one interesting thing that we see is we'll see a contrast between like, here's what the data says. And then sometimes shop owners will say, well, like, hey, like so-and-so said X,
sedatives.
Y, or Z. And we're like, oh, okay. So we'll dive in and say, is there an issue here? And we're like, well, the hundreds of folks that are actually ordering more every month, you're not going to hear from them as an owner,
Nope.
but you hear from that one person who has a reference points about Denny prices from 1998. You know, and
Yep.
so
Yep.
that's very astute and I think really helpful insight there.
Really quick, honestly, we spend a lot of time in our consulting services on mindset related things and like foundational principles.
Mm.
And the reason we do that a lot is just to help remind people of how our brains are wired and how we work. The reality is we tend to take negative feedback and attach far more weight to it than we do positive feedback. We also tend to have a primacy bias and a recency bias. That is like the very first thing and the most recent thing, we tend to bias more heavily. And so when you're operating as a business owner, you have to think about this stuff. You have to check for those biases, and having good, strong data is one of the ways to do that. And so we really encourage people to like, hey, it's okay to have feelings. It's okay to understand that there are some people who are frustrated, but on the whole, most people are totally fine with this. And sure, there's going to be a squeaky wheel. Like, that's okay. You know, at the end of the day, there's a phrase that people say, which is that change only happens when the pain of staying the same becomes greater than the pain of change. Because it is always, you are going to have some sort of pain. And for me, the point that happened was when I was just consistently working harder and harder and more hours, and I never saw the bank account grow in the business. And I realized it was like the pain of getting a 4-star review because our price is too high is far less than the pain of never making money despite working harder and harder and harder. And so for me, it was just like, okay, cool. Like, write a 4-star review all day long, homie. Like, people are still coming here. They're still buying all this stuff because they still care, and this is still providing value for them. And I know that because we are still busy.
You know, I feel like there's a lot of fear for owners in raising prices. And one thing that I saw is that you mentioned setting expectations earlier in this conversation. And I think one of the things that coffee shop owners can do to combat the possibilities of those squeaky wheels is giving advance notice and explaining what's going on, because customers, they want to support your local business and whatnot. And I think when they feel like they're getting nickel or dimed or things are increasing everywhere else, it's really easy to then suddenly complain about to somebody who you have a relationship with, like, hey, this, oh my gosh, it's happening again. They can feel like a judgment on your business and you as an owner. But being transparent and letting them know where these things are coming from, customers are very open to wanting to then rally behind you even more and accept the change. And oftentimes, like, you guys need to raise your prices. You have a great product and don't sell yourself short, you know? So I think there's a lot that can be done too. And I love how you talk about educating people on just their mental and approach to things and reminding them how we're kind of wired.
I think we have a perfect segue here where you're talking about that pain of working and working, and you just, as an owner, start feeling like you're banging your head against a wall and you're not getting the growth or the impact. You're not getting the relief that you feels like you're probably holding your breath for years on end. And then you start making decisions. I think we see this sometimes can be counterproductive. You're introducing more things, more flavor, more complexity to the business, trying to chase, trying to get that silver bullet that's going to be the relief. I think for us, and just bringing it to that point of sale conversation, that was really the intention and the idea of how we built Joe, this idea of like, hey, the research says that your customers, the reality is, if you're creating a great customer experience, how do people consume coffee? Well, even your regular customers that you see in the morning, they're going to other businesses right now. It's probably Starbucks if it's not convenient. And that idea of what is service and hospitality and coffee in this age, and how does that grow the pie for everyone? How do we get that relief, get that growth? Maybe we can talk a little bit about that point of sale conversation. If I can frame it, Brennan and I have been talking a lot about this. How do we frame this conversation in a way that is just like turns the light on for owners? And would love to get your perspective here. I think where we're kind of landing on is realizing that there's this paradigm for owners that is, hey, this is, a point of sale is a tool that I use to process payments. And then if it helps me on the back end on the admin stuff, then like, aces. And then I know that, and then it's like, I'm just gonna have to pay subscriptions for those tools. And, this is just the cost of doing business. And we're trying to really land this paradigm of like, let's have indie coffee owners thinking about that tech on their counter the way that Starbucks does, which is, and not to say you need to be Starbucks, but that's the number one driver for growth in their business that's not related to opening more locations. And so let's talk about that a little bit. Put us in the mind of an owner on a point of sale transition. How do we at Joe make that way easier? What else can we do? And yeah, just tell me a little bit about how you think about that. Then we can spend a few minutes unpacking it.
So there are a few things that are really common that business owners, like some traps that are common to kind of fall into. One of the mindset things that we talk a lot about with our clients actually is an expense mindset versus an investment mindset. And it's very common for people to only think of the cost, the expense of something without thinking of the return. And where you really kick it into high gear as a business owner is when you can think of returns on your investment and leveraging those well to increase your sort of overall capacity and assets. And so when it comes to thinking of a POS, almost everybody thinks of it as an expense, right? It is just a cost of doing business. At the end of the day, it should be an investment. It should be something that improves your operation and facilitates increased transactions, increased hospitality, and the value that you're delivering to your guests. If it's not improving things actively, then you shouldn't be doing it. It's really easy to fall into that sort of thinking, and I understand why, right? At the end of the day, time is a resource that almost none of us, we can't get more of. It's finite. A lot of people usually think of just the features and those sorts of things on a time-saving basis, but what they miss is the power that this information can have to help you make good decisions and the way that it can drive sales. And so for everybody listening here, we've sort of been talking a little bit over the last 6-ish weeks. I had a ton of questions for you guys. I'm just like, hey, yo, I want to hear about your system. Like I mentioned before, good ideas are fine. Execution's what really matters. But I want to hear about your ideas. And I had just asked you guys a bunch of questions. Like the big thing that we started talking about was loyalty program. I was kind of sharing on threads that oftentimes the way that most coffee shops have done loyalty programs is not compelling to me because it usually sort of cuts away at margin that most business owners can't even really get. And they tend to give away their own profit because they feel like they're supposed to just be doing something. And Brendan reached out and was like, word. Also, like, there's a lot of data on this stuff that it can be done differently. And so I just wanted to hear from you on how that works. And so, like, I guess for people listening, if you guys could just share your thoughts around how that works, I think it's really interesting. And I think it's helps to transition away from that expense mindset into an investment mindset. And what I think is really cool is the way that you guys prove it. Like from what I've seen, you're willing to pay for your hardware if people's sales don't increase 20% year over year. Mm-hmm. That nobody's doing that. No one is like actually planted their flag on. Not only is our POS like going to do tasks for you, but it is a growth tool. It is an investment tool. And we believe in it so strongly that we'll put our money on it. So I think that's incredible. I would love if you guys would share a little bit more about your loyalty program and how you think about it.
I really appreciate that. Thank you for that sentiment. I think for us, we've worked hard to be in integrity in our intention to align our interests with those of coffee shop owners and baristas in particular, because we know that it's hard to run a business and it's even harder when you're doing it on systems that isolate you. So you have to do everything on your own. And we look at the Starbucks and these large chains and the advantages they have on unit economics because of their scale, on the brand, on the standardization of workflow. You don't know as an owner, and they get all these learnings across millions and millions of customer behavior data points across thousands and thousands of locations. For us, we took the approach of, if we are to unlock the same benefits from technology for small business owners that these massive companies have, what might that look like? And that's informed everything. We're not a point of sale. If you want a point of sale in that traditional sense, like do that. But we're a tech layer, that we're an operating system that is built to grow market share for indies by making it really convenient and rewarding for customers. And so we know in our data we have without fail, every single shop that has been on the platform for 12 months has grown at least 20%. We've seen it go up to 70%. There is so much creative potential waiting to be unlocked in indie coffee at the store level and at the category level that honestly, that 20% is not that much compared to what we're going to be able to facilitate and allow. We design everything around incremental purchases, keeping top of mind, rather than if you're running Square or Toast, whatever loyalty program, it's like, oh, sure, I'll take a discount at the end of the purchase that I was already going to make and I'm already here for. If it's not creating incremental purchase occasions or retention or frequency or average tickets, then it's just taking a bite out of your bottom line.
Yeah, I think the easiest way that I like to articulate it is right now, every single coffee shop is on their own island and they see each other as competition when really every independent or community coffee shop, we are supporting one another and we are collaborators. And so when we look at this, not through the lens of my brick and mortar, my business, my brand, and instead, where is the customer? What do they want? How can I meet them where they prefer? Then the overall idea is, as you mentioned, the e pluribus unum, out of many, one, cater to the customer. We are in the customer service industry, and what do they want? They want to have the most convenient way to support local businesses. So it's an intrinsic value that they're getting as well as being able to just get the great coffee that they love every single day and not have to settle for something else. And one of the big misnomers, I think, is that people think, oh, well, if I'm on this marketplace, I'm sharing my customers. And well, here's the big secret. The average consumer consumes coffee at 3 different times throughout the day. So if you don't have a coffee shop where they live, work, and play, your customers are already ordering at different coffee shops, whether it's a community coffee shop or most likely a Starbucks or a Dutch Bros or whatever it may be. So the way that we really approach the space and why we are so different is because we are a marketplace of the fastest growing community coffee shops and coffee lovers in one place. We give you the tools and the technology to cater to your customers' wants and preferences. And so by doing this, we're able to manage a reward system across every single coffee shop. So now the customer isn't juggling rewards cards or balances that it's a buy 10, get one free and takes them months to ever redeem something. It is one loyalty program where they are incentivized to always choose local coffee and to be able to get those rewards more frequently. And by doing so, we're able to cut those costs in half for coffee shops while driving a 400% return on investment. So rather than a buy 10, get one free, as you say, you know with Joe, you are getting for every $1 I spend, I'm getting $4 back. It's a great business case for any company that's looking to grow and be successful. And Nick, you just mentioned one last thing. Any independent coffee shop, it's this big data play. And this is what we shared with every single coffee shop is you do not have to do this on your own. You don't have to have a marketing background and spend your weekends putting things together. We are essentially your marketing partner that gives you all the tools and technology with the ability for you to tap into millions of customers nationwide that we are always working on optimizing in order to bring them back to you and build your brand and build their loyalty at your location.
So Maxwell, we're like way over the already generous hour that you had given us. What is the number one thing that will make it easier for shops to switch systems that are just a cost center rather than an investment for them? And then number two, what parting words do you have for the audience? How can they find you? Where should they reach out? All right. It sounds like you're still accepting email from your narrative email. But where should they find you now?
Yeah. So, man, as far as the switching, the act of switching over is definitely a bit of a Herculean effort on the part of a business owner. Like building a POS takes a surprising amount of time. I imagine to just code all of it takes infinitely more. But as a business owner, it's like, man, I just got to go in and put in the everything in categories and set it this way and do all the stuff and make sure that I didn't forget my extra hot and my kids temp and add whipped cream and all those little things that just add up a lot. So one of the things that I think can be helpful is reducing that pain point for folks. I don't know if you guys have a porting tool.
We do. We build the menus for every partner. We do that as a service.
Yeah. So that's huge. And as a busy business owner, that is a worthwhile thing in my estimation to free people up for.
Love it.
So that's a big one. And then, just testing things out and trying to like understand where you are gaining value and investing in things that are going to produce more reward for you and more benefit, and I think that it's like, again, people generally don't change something until like the pain of staying the same is like higher than the pain of change. And I think like for people who are trying to improve their business and they're having a hard time finding ways to do that, some proven tools that people can, like really smart people who are paid to understand and analyze data and have a much wider pool of which to analyze that, and then have a vested interest in making your customers return, right? Because that's what I think is really amazing about the way that you guys have structured yourselves is you built this whole thing based on these principles of collective action to be able to gain economies of scale. You really understand the values of specialty coffee in a way that almost nobody else does that I've ever seen in the tech space. These principles of community over competition are so fundamentally part of the way that most specialty operators think about things that it's really refreshing to see you guys build an entire platform toward that end. There's back in like 2014, 2012 in that territory, there was a bunch of coffee shops in DC that started a disloyalty program where they basically gave out punch cards to go to different independent operators. You guys built a whole POS like system around it and like help like you have taken JFK's incredible ethos of a rising tide lifting all boats and really worked to like turn on the water pumps and help make this tide increase. One of the challenges and one of the things we spend time working with people on a mindset is around the ideas of a zero-sum game, which is that there's only so much pie that goes around. And so anytime my percentage of that pie increases or decreases, I'm winning and somebody else is losing. And it's always this sort of like win versus loss. That's not how it works. You can make a bigger pie. And even if you take a smaller percentage of that pie, it can still be more pie for everyone. I think that we can all work together to make a better experience for our guests and just create more value for people. And I think that your whole system is just really very clearly to me laser focused on doing all of that, which I think is really powerful and really cool. And I've just been super impressed. Like I worked with your guys' mobile app back in the day and it was great, but it just wasn't able to integrate in the way that we worked with things. And then like hearing from you again that you build a whole freaking system around it is just insane. Like around that, those ideas of the like community working together, it's just awesome. And you guys have done such an amazing job of helping remember and remind people that at the very end of the day, we're kind of your customers, but at the end of the day, the end consumer, the end customer is all of our customers. And we have to understand how they work. There's a thing that I show people a lot. It's called a desire path. It's a classic blunder in architecture or space planning where like you see it a lot in parks where someone laid out a preferred path where they want people to walk. And then you see a dirt trail just go somewhere else because people are like, I don't want to walk on that. Like that's the least efficient way to get there. And they call them desire paths. And it's one of my favorite illustrations of the fact that you just cannot fight human nature. You have to work with it. If you want to design something that is helpful and actually moving the needle in the world and in your own life, you have to consider how people behave. And what I think is really incredible is that you guys have built a system that leverages understanding how people behave on behalf of everybody. And I think that's really cool. So super impressed.
Max, do you want my job? You're doing better. You're doing a better job at explaining what we do by far than I do. I am so grateful for that sentiment. Wow. Like you just blew me away. Brendan, do you want to kind of wrap this up?
Yeah, I want to echo Nick's sentiment. Thank you, Max. That's very kind. And I think it just means the absolute world to us. It makes me emotional because it's been years of hard work. So
yeah, you guys have built something really cool. It's really impressive. It means a lot to me that anything I ever had to say had an impact enough to do something like that. I think you've built something truly meaningful. And like, that's not something everybody gets to do. I know that like you've had your heads down for so long, you know, like working and working. And I've had those seasons of just like head down, nose to the grindstone. And you're like, I think this is going to work. And I know you're barely like getting your head up right now, but I really think that this is going to be something special for not only you guys, but just for the whole community, and a way that like, I'm really stoked to see it. And I really hope that I think it's going to make a big difference, you know, and actively improve the lives of so many people. So awesome.
Thank you for that, Maxwell. I will say too, what's wild is, and I think why it feels like this feels like a really incredible moment, because we really held on to the early conversations we had with you back in 2019. We used your story and narrative as a mental touch point of the standard that we wanted to hit and what we wanted to accomplish. And so it took longer than honestly thought that it would. There was a lot of those systems. Every element that we add to it add exponential complexity, right? And the relationships. And when we release one feature, we have like 95 things we have to test, like a list that we go through every little thing, because everything's connected between the barista, owner, and customer. I have so much. I want to partner with you on, I think you do incredible job of marrying head and heart on here's the reality of the data, and then here's how this lands with the heart and resonates with the intention of what we're trying to create in ways that we can really learn from. I think the industry can really learn from, and I hope that we can do more of this in the future and really partner with you on this, because it's unique, man. And this is really, really grateful for you taking the time. Really appreciate it.